Thank you for tuning in, and welcome to Size of Thoughts, conversations with the Alliance of History graduate students. My name is Jacob Glicklick, and I'm the producer for the show. The things you will hear over the next hour represent the views of Size of Thoughts and the people making them. These opinions, conversations, and quotations do not in any way represent River West Radio. The persons responsible are solely the producer, guests, and people calling in. Consequently, River West Radio is not liable for legal issues arising from the content you're about to hear. So again, thanks for joining us tonight, and thanks as well to first-time guests on this show, Niles Namath.
Thanks for having me.
And John Terry.
All right, thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. So given the three of us having this conversation, I'm going to take it as a standing assumption that capitalism is the pressing problem of our time, that it is, for reasons that we could have any number of separate conversations on, ineffective, unrepresentative, eroding for the material well-being and dignity of majority of people, etc. But to my mind, then the more pressing question becomes, what do we do next? And to that end, first question for both guests, and then I guess eventually we'll have to try to answer myself, is what explains capitalism still enduring as long as it has, given that I think so many aspects of it are fairly blatantly corrupt and leaning towards corruption, fairly directly against the even self-interest of majority of people. What explains its resilience? Why do we still have to deal with this?
Take it away, man.
That's a pretty big question. Why is capitalism so resilient? Well, for a lot of things it works. It is an effective system. There has been a lot of advancement under the capitalist system, a lot of technological advancement. It's given us the ability to, produce more than enough of the resources that are necessary to meet the needs of all humanity. But there are the contradictions inherent in it, that there is a possibility of providing every human being with all their needs, but because of the profit motive, not doing so. And I think, there are a lot of mechanisms built into capitalism that allow it to be so resilient. And there are also a lot of historical factors. I think, if you look at, over the 20th century, there was crisis after crisis. But there was also, that you had, revolutionary situations. You had 1917. In the 1930s, you had, radical organization in the United States. But, ultimately it failed. And I think it's something that we need to, I think it's something we need to consider more. As academics, it's something that we really need to think of and question as we, progress on our quests to develop knowledge, particularly historical knowledge.
Yeah, I would. I agree. One thing is that, right, it is a system that has produced many things, and I think that that's where also part of this, and I would not call it inertial, but it's certainly a system that builds upon its successes in a way by privileging the certain things, right? So if you think like a spaceship is really good, well then capitalism probably has a lot to do with that. Or if you think that, suburban sprawl is good, right? Like there's a lot of things that are sort of tied up with notions of freedom, right? Like that people deserve to get to own whatever they want, do whatever they want with it. If I acquire a piece, and especially when you apply that to property, so in terms of resources, right? If I own this piece of property, I can do whatever I want with it. So I think that there's certain, and then also if you look at sort of what the media has had to offer us since the first Sears catalogs, right? Since media really even spread across the United States, one of the first things that carried it was the Sears catalog, which was even more prominent nationally before newspapers. So you really are tied. Attitudes about what's good and what's not good are very much tied to consumerism, and in some ways, very obviously, but in some ways it's a little bit more sinister. And I think now that there's always been a certain amount of people who are sort of fed up with it or who can tell, but it's constantly advertising, television, magazines, sports, any sort of televised or internet-based media is so tied with consumerism that I don't even know if we can. I don't think that people are fully aware of it, even though we all like hate commercials and things like that. The more subtle ways that you are sort of programmed to be a consumer, and that's not to say false consciousness or that it's purely inertial, but I think that you take a few successes, like Niles is talking about, and everybody of course looks back to like the post-war world as this sort of glamorous time, but there were plenty of people who weren't that happy then too. But take a few successes, amplify them, say that it's only because of capitalism, even though there's the issue of World War, and then tie it in with all these other cultural attitudes, and I think it builds upon itself in a way that, if you say I don't want to get a job, people think you're insane, right? Instead of like, why you're insane to work at a really crappy job for $7 an hour, you're insane to think that you shouldn't do that. So there's definitely something there culturally.
Yeah, and I think it seems that the connection of consumerism becomes partly, that it's not even just false consciousness. I think it does happen at some level, but also even people who are conscious that the system is horrible but still go along with it anyway. It seems that, I guess, every major dominant world system has had ways of inculcating against dissent and being resilient against crisis, but capitalism perhaps seems better at corrupting everyday people and even doubly corrupting academics, who are any number of paper, radical of it, but are still existing as consumers, existing as part of the world because it's a very appealing option. It's very easy, and it is however much it's against interests. I mean, for us as workers, as consumer, if you have however amount of money of it, there are things that you can buy and you can access quickly, cleanly, effectively, and all it costs is a small piece of your soul. But at some level, it's not possible to avoid making that change, to not be pushing towards institutional corporate power with every purchase. I mean, somewhat more so than others, but it does seem that the corrupting influence, even when you don't get as much from corruption, becomes the important thing in making people be either accepted as a positive moral good or just get tired enough to go through an individual inertia.
I think with also another element would be professionalization, which is similar and goes along with this, but also the fact that if you don't want to participate, well, it's extremely difficult to not participate, right? Because you have to somehow take care of yourself, right? Like if you occupy property, like legally somewhere down the line, you're supposed to pay a tax on that, right? So it's, dropping out of the system is a possibility, but it's easy. I can understand the view that, this thing, we hate it, but we have to do it because really you got to make money. People, I think, feel that, even though there are alternatives, but we can probably talk about alternatives a little later.
And I think another thing to consider is that capitalism is very cyclical. There are good times and there are bad times. And when times are good for the vast majority of people, there's really no incentive to question the system, even though the exploitation continues. And it's really only in the periods of crisis, like we're living through now, that an increasing number of people are really willing or see it as necessary to question it. And even then, I think it takes a lot of thought, a lot of time, a lot of energy to effectively critique the system and locate alternatives. And there's a certain number of people who see that they remember when times were good and they expect that to return, and so they don't question when times are bad. They don't question the system. Why are things so terrible? Why is everyone losing their homes? Why are wages going down? Why are we losing our benefits? It's mostly, well, we just have to wait this out and things will get better maybe in 5 years.
Yeah, the idea that the recession is like, not built into the system or something, like it's always going to be temporary, or this is particularly bad, but, and then there's always enough, there are enough people to throw around as success stories too, that, if you make a super nice house and a really nice car and really nice clothes, if you make that the object of your desire, then there's plenty of examples of people who have it. And so even though people who are never, ever, ever going to have it can still be at least tantalized, right? That there's that sort of seductive quality of goods that make people think, maybe if I save up, I'll get that boat or something and I'll be happy, or whatever it is that you want. I think that is a part of it too. The fact that people do have these things sort of makes it look like it's in the realm of possibility for you.
And similarly, I mean, the alternative to have effective action is some mechanism for collective mobilization with people that I think, certainly now, I mean, individual discontent and cynicism comes much more easily and much more readily in a large variety of mediums. But if there's also cynicism about the ability of any other institution, either in terms of real, in terms of theoretical, and certainly, I mean, a lot of the sort of cynicism about the left as a whole is either sort of in terms of crazy Marxist, crazy hippies, crazy lazy hippies, crazy anarchists. I mean, either way, there's those are sort of labels that build very much off some individual experience that, again, the kind of life sucks, but no, it doesn't mean people don't go to work for a given point. And it seems that that's one thing that's partly changed, that in the past there might have been less structural critique by some of the people that were acting, but certainly contrast the 30s to now, there I think more effective developing of tactics.
Yeah, it's over there.
Yeah, not our music, okay, yeah. But somewhat more directive of sort of the direct immediate tactics and mobilization, because there's a group, because, I mean, depending which segment of the workers we're talking about, but if you have some concept of a viable grassroots union, actually in a way that you had in the 30s and don't really have many cases after that, if you have sort of immigrant communities that have to rely together, I mean, in some cases they're just, for any number of immediate, practical, daily reasons, are not buying into the ultra-individualist form in a way that, it seems that some aspects of that delusion become more possible over the last 30 years, even as the actual incentive and what you can actually benefit from them are eroded.
Yeah, I think one of the greatest possibilities, for organization that is the advance in communications technology, which is vastly different than it was in the 1930s or even in the 1980s. With the internet, it's much more possible for people to organize on a much broader scale. So people can organize not just in their community, but they can organize, throughout the nation or internationally. And I think that leads to great possibilities for challenging capitalism and for organizing people to do that, because people can't do it as individuals.
Yeah.
And it's a way to secure funding too right now, which is like extremely difficult. That sort of opens up that network. I think there's two things that you bring up there. One, talking about thinking about Occupy movement, thinking about going back all the way back to the Capitol and Madison is like one of the biggest slams that you'll get is like, I would have came and protested, but I have a job, right? As though anybody who is protesting against capitalism has somehow failed so miserably that they cannot participate, or that they're unable to participate. I think when you're saying that, this idea of sort of the lazy, crazy hippie, that's really powerful, because it's very easy to pass that off as, well, we've seen these goofballs before, and look at their teepee in the park there or whatever, and you can sort of pass that off. And really, I think it's pretty remarkable anytime that you, one, directly challenge authority, right, to do something that's against the law, and another, to just even actually be actively protesting against, or even just questioning the ultimate supremacy of the system, is actually, that's been dangerous for a long time, and especially, when we're talking about maybe thinking more globally, or immigrant communities, that's people who can be deported for just talking about these kinds of things. So, and I think we see that May Day is, as much as it is like all these things, contradictory, right? That it becomes, same with technology, it becomes this sort of celebration of technology. Like, you're not going to have a flat screen handheld communication device without capitalism, right? It's like these diverse minerals that have to be procured from all around the world. These things are the things that are even making this possible, which is fine, because you'd have to think, if you're going to fight the system, it's a system that is so pervasive that you'll have to, on some levels, fight from within, even if other people are fighting from outside the system. At some point, you've got to use the technology, I guess, of the oppressors.
Yeah, and I think one advantage in modern communications technologies is just the potential speed and fluidity they can have with that. I mean, partly is a way of mobilizing other people, but at a certain point, if you see image of someone, in terms of getting beaten half to death or more than half to death by cops, that translates out, whether it's 3 miles from you or several continents away. Similarly, if you can have rapid exchange and study, and sort of, I mean, to some extent, the politics of space and politics contesting space translate fairly well across different areas. So it provides the ability to actually learn from what's effective, what's not, and be able to make impact with the numbers that you have. But of course, the other side of this is that the right is also globally coordinated, and much more so than was at any time in the past. And I would say arguably has been more effective at figuring out strategies and adapting to different environments and pushing and doing messaging and switching things and somewhat switching tactics and rhetoric when hasn't worked. Look at even the fact that the hippies, even beyond people that aren't going to be up defending for LBJ's America or Nixon's America or Vietnam War will still think crazy in terms of dope smoking bums or bra burning feminists or sort of in terms of black activists that were going too far, and we're not not the kind of friendly ones, but we're doing radical counterproductive.
They were the racists.
They hate that hate produces.
Yeah.
So I guess that's another thing that I would say makes modern capitalism somewhat, I think, different than in the past. Even while a lot of the things are cyclical and are built into the structures of taking what it can when it does and producing crisis from that, is I think that the policymakers on the right, people within ALEC and Business Roundtable and the like, are more likely, I think, to believe their own rhetoric and justification and operate without restraint. At this point, because of some of the belief circles that you can have from the internet, because of the impact of think tanks, I think they're likely to be far less concerned with long-term consequences they're doing, and far less hampered by sort of doubt or ethics, or even think of 19th century robber barons and that contrast of it. There still might be, in terms of, I think, a notion of guilt or Christianity that, as still with the anti-materialist message, that might not necessarily change their accumulation of wealth. It means giving some of it back, and I think that changes a little bit of the operating system. I think that's effectively gone. I think now, whether in most cases aren't necessarily reading Ayn Rand, but are buying into either whether the sort of modern religious right variant of it that glorifies excessive wealth, so they don't have any notion of internal restraint, and under the political system that's undergoing, increasingly don't have any kind of opposition for even the most extreme mechanisms electorally.
Well, you have the supposedly liberal party, the Democratic Party, is itself a right-wing party, but it postures as the defender of the working class. They put themselves forward as fighting for the common man, but when it gets down to it, they're funded just as much by Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan as the Republican Party, and their policies, are frog's hair different than the Republican Party. So if you're looking for an alternative, it's not going to come from the Democrats.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd say that even, and I think Democrats posture very much at being defending the working class, posture at defending sort of middle class, since that's what everyone in America, is, or supposed to be on the verge of achieving that. But
we saw what Barrett, said is the union issue, I'll think about it, right? What was ostensibly the reason for the recall or the reason for massive protests, and really, the candidate says, I'll bring them to the table. I will screw them over still, but I will at least do it at the table. Walker wouldn't even do it at the table.
Yeah.
Which is, I think that's where you get at. I think that is sort of what neoliberalism is on some level. Take the post-war mentality about just this limitless, insane expansion of markets and production of goods, and then mix it with this certain Christian right moral element on some level to sort of justify yourself, and then also continue to trump up this, it's billionaires telling everyone it's a time of scarcity, right? We have to sacrifice, and it's always millionaires and billionaires who are sort of talking about the sacrifices that the working class is going to make. So we're going to have to cut state budgets, and police are not going to get paid as much, and teachers are not going to get paid as much, and we're going to cut down our state park employees, and we're going to cut hours on our libraries and things like that, as though there was really a time of scarcity. As profits go up, they actually sort of use that. I think that is kind of this, under the neoliberal paradigm, at least from the 1970s, when there wasn't a threat that the working class was getting a little bit too much, to sort of say, we've got to, return to the Gilded era. Like, we really need this top 10% to be far and away in control of things. Really simple for them to operate. You're talking about, it's not like a conspiracy. It's public information, right? There's like 3,000 people who decide everything for the entire, for a major part of the globe, right? And I think that that's the new paradigm. Means Democrat, Republican, rhetoric. The debate comes down to Roe versus Wade, or gay marriage,
identity
or
politics.
anything that can to say like, well, yeah, we're all going to spend a lot on the war. We're all going to make sure healthcare is privatized, but we'll just have these sort of issues that affect 20% of the population instead of focusing on issues that affect everybody.
Yeah, and of course, this would happen just because structurally. I mean, why wouldn't your business invest, in both parties? Perhaps, more heavily in one that's going to give more favorable terms. But of course, you make sure that if there's only sort of two options, either way, it's 90% is going to be favorable to you and your shareholders and your setup of it. And the other context of it, I mean, it forms a useful distracting mechanism. I mean, as much as some of the, in terms of religious right and conservative, and the focus a lot of the sort of energy towards homophobia, towards anti-immigrant sentiments, towards blatant racism as a way of, in some cases, channeling the actual people who have seen things in their lives get drastically worse and do not have mechanisms in terms of so-called liberals to speak to either the substance of that or to the anger. And again, the sort of conservatives are more effective at pushing that, and also it just becomes a distracting technique. Look at the amount of the news cycle that was dominated by the Republican presidential primary. I mean, at the end of the day, surprise, the candidate with vastly more funding and an actually professional staff, as opposed to the handful of people Santorum was going for it, managed to secure the nomination in what was said to be like one of the most barren, like least effective, even on their own terms, candidate. But how many news stories, like in terms of every surge? I mean, Gingrich, screams and rants against sort of media, but he's so much a creation that by being a sort of temporary topic interest story, that makes it a slight surprise, draws more attention. Whereas, and obviously that serves a lot of benefit in not having people's time and energy be involved with anything that's actually happening politically. The changes, impact of, for instance, the Rahm Emanuel's Chicago, sort of mass privatization under the same period. I don't think got beyond sort of local interest. And also at that point, people are like, politics, just don't, no cause for it there. No, don't really want to follow it. Just depressing. Better go out and and just focus energy on other things and not worry so much about it.
Well, I think that apathy arises out of the fact that none of what they see within the political system appeals to them. And I think one of the greatest challenges for the left, and I guess the radical left, if you will, is to get working people to see that the Democratic Party is no longer the party of FDR, and it's no longer the party of Johnson. That enacting the sort of measures that those presidents enacted would really be revolutionary in this period, and that it's not going to come about through voting for Barack Obama again.
Yeah, and that even go even further. I mean, give me the Republican Party under Nixon in a lot of ways in terms of domestic policy of it, as offering a number of more substantial, immediate improvements and working towards more of it. I mean, that in some ways of it becomes the sort of conservative candidate that after LBJ can consolidate and make palpable a few things. Obama becomes very much the so-called liberal candidate after Bush that consolidates and makes unproblematic and mainstream things like Guantanamo, like Libya,
assassination of American citizens.
NDA, but even looking at that, I mean, the dynamic becomes clearer just how much further the Obama's consolidation still pushes it towards the right. That it's increasingly there's no real, even I think, pretense of balance. So I agree that I think the break with Democratic Party and recognition of where they're at structurally, things happen. But I guess the only good news is that in some cases it's become so blatant, so shameless, so wanton that that provides a huge amount of opportunities to do that. And
I think the two-party system sort of, I mean, as it is constituted right now, is like the ultimate ruse, because, like you said, business can play to both. It doesn't really matter, and if the goal is essentially the same of both parties, to sort of enrich few people at the expense of many, then you've got sort of one of the groups can be saying, we want church and school, and the other group can say that's crazy. But at the end of the day, they're both trying to make sure that you are poor and working most of the time and not getting anything for it. It sort of gives you, it's the illusion of an option, which is why it's always so sensationalized, which is it's always over emotional issues and things like that, always over sort of things, I'm not to like, I wouldn't call it a fringe issue because it's important to the people that it's important to, but the things that affect 100% of us are rarely discussed. The things that affect some of us become much more important. And when you've got a system where it's like you're going to have to pick one of us. One of us is going to tell you this and do this. The other person is going to tell you this and do this. And really, it kind of works as the ultimate ruse.
Yeah, and also similarly connects to the fact that if people like Barrett especially running as Republican light, of course they're going to lose because they're not going to have as much funding of it, and they're not going to have even appearance of integrity. So why wouldn't people go for a candidate that's somewhat more unambiguous?
Yeah. Right. There's no appeal. There was no appeal with Barrett.
Yeah, and I guess in the broader context of Democrats, with the disclaimer, I certainly understand that if people, even if they can see issues with the faults, will still, view the Republicans as so gross and problematic and extreme, and depending on where your candidate is, insane.
Yeah.
That would still say let's go for the lesser of the evils, but regardless of that, I'm not sure, depending on what the person was or what sort of voting for, or what felt would be a benefit would impact how I would argue this. But either way, there has to be more than beyond that. Viewing any kind of change through electoral politics is
we have to get beyond
suicidal.
Lesser evilism.
Yeah.
If the Democratic president, who's supposedly progressive, who wins the Nobel Peace Prize, kills one American citizen, would the Republican have killed two?
Yeah.
How much worse is that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So again, a more difficult question then, in terms of how, or specifically that, moving beyond that, what, in terms of contesting our current, in terms of political paralysis and more broader, capitalism under a period of crisis, perhaps it's, ultimate crisis, or perhaps just one of the other crises that's only, wrecking a large number of people's lives in the here and now.
I think maybe, I don't know, I guess I'm thinking the good news, but I don't know if it's good news, but it's that the vast inequality that we've seen emerge over the past 30 years is not tenable. That, it's grown astronomically, but it can't stand. It's at the levels that it was in 1929, if not higher, social, economic inequality. And we saw what happened then. I think what we saw in 2008 with the collapse of Lehman Brothers and the collapse of the housing market, I think is just a precursor to a much larger crisis that will emerge. And out of that, I think there will be more revolutionary situations. I think the Occupy movement is just an initial indication of what we'll see. And so too are the protests that we see in Greece, the revolution in Egypt, the revolution in Tunisia. I think those are just precursors to much larger events that will happen. And it's a matter of preparing for that. I think that a political perspective needs to be worked out that will allow for such revolutionary situations to advance to a stage that they can succeed. Because I think we've seen in Egypt that there wasn't that kind of political perspective, and the revolution has more or less failed.
I would, I think one thing that's really important there too is like mentioning the global nature of this, right? That the United States, we can't really think of ourselves onto ourselves when we're talking about the impacts of capitalism, right? And our own dangerous, reckless military adventures all over the planet, that those things are definitely intertwined. So, something like Greece, I know is frightening to people in the United States. People with power, I think that the thing that we've got to think of is one thing about capitalism is eventually it's a zero-sum game. You can only cut down forests until they're gone. You can only extract oil until it's gone. There are actual endpoints built into the system, right? You exploit until there's nothing left to exploit. At some point, you're going to run out of things to sensibly and efficiently exploit, which could be dangerous. And you could say that capitalists have been pretty good at avoiding that, but in the long run, that actually is a wall that's going to be. We will run out of oil eventually. That will be something that will change the world economic infrastructure. Then I think another thing is to think of, to not think of fighting in terms of necessarily winning something and having a sustainable victory for yourselves. Whoever has the money, the power, the military, the police, they're going to keep on fighting. They have a lot of experience being really good at doing it. They have badges and licenses and things like that give them authorization to kill their own citizens if they want to, right? Even during peaceful protests. I think when you see something like the Occupy movement, and I'll go back to when we were on the bridge here, occupying the bridge in Milwaukee, bump into a 65-year-old woman who said, I'm not even political. I just really don't like what Walker's doing. That people who would not consider themselves even remotely radical are breaking the law, occupying a bridge. I think that says something, and I think that protest culture has always been here, whether the media sort of stops caring in the 70s or not. I think that people have always had those responses. I think it's, you're really thinking that there's not going to be a day that sort of the good team wins and the bad team is sent home or killed or whatever. It's going to be perennial struggle. You can be on top, right? Civil rights movement was, on top for 10, 15 years, and then Reagan dismantles it in 8 years, right? A long movement that was dismantled very quickly. George W. Bush does the same things that sort of COINTELPRO do. There's no sustainable victory, so you got to sort of forget about that idea that there's something that you can necessarily win, because we don't really know what that would be, I don't think, and no one's going to forget capitalism, right? I don't think that people are going to forget that. So even if it's doomsday scenario, which I don't put out of the realm of possibility, I think a World War III would be something that would be terrible and ugly, and either way, if we're going to be sustainable, half the people on the planet are probably going to have to die anyways to be to handle the resources, or people are going to have to think more sociably and actually start distributing the resources now and using them much less, and actually think about sustaining ourselves. But barring that, I think it's thinking about how to protect yourself when these kind of things happen. So I think that community gardens, chicken coops, knowing how, think in 1920, the idea that you would live without professionals, services, and other people's help, much more realistic to a large percentage of the population. Still, right now, urban areas only cover in the United States 1% of the land in the United States, right? So I think that there's ways that people could think about taking care of themselves and avoiding the system. Stop paying taxes, grow your own food, make your own clothes, take care of your stuff, help people, and I think it's like River West. It would be way too idealized to say that there's anything like that going on here, but there's 3 co-ops in the area. It's like I'm part owner of a bar here, actually. I think that things like co-ops and stuff like that, if you have the right scale and the right attitudes, the right people involved, that there's things like that can, I don't think it's a solution, because I don't think that there's one problem that you can solve. And, you can't just say capitalism's the problem, let's solve it by getting rid of it. I think it's so complex that I don't know what the win would look like.
I think what you said, I think it might bring us to the point of thinking about, as historians, what is our role in this? What can we do? And I think, it's crucial that we provide that historical perspective so that people understand that, you're not going to win one day and things are going to be better, that there is, if there is a revolution, there's going to be a massive reaction. And it's a matter of being prepared for that. We've seen it time and again in history. And we can learn that lesson and we can prepare. And as historians, we can impart those lessons to people.
Up to a point, I would agree. understanding, if nothing else, the depth of struggle of it, and the sort of the scale, and the different kind of resources, and what's brought up with whether running through overt police repression, through infiltration, to being co-opted. But I guess also, I'm slightly wary of the concept, or the assumption of historians that we sort of exist now and envision our that we basically sort of like figure it out on some level of like what's happening now, what needs to happen next, and then we provide it with everyone else. I think there's certainly a amount of things that context hindsight gives to, but I also think it's not inherently even possible to have objectivity in our situation from within consumer society where they sort of exist now. I think that a tendency often by intellectuals who are the most sure and have the best theory and concept of it are also, over the last 50 years, those who are most removed from actually doing anything.
Intellectuals are important, but they don't make the best leaders. But and I don't think it's a matter of providing a blueprint to people as here are the steps that you have to do, but you can give that sort of perspective that here's what has happened in the past, here are the mistakes people have made, here are the advances people have made, and here's why it's regressed, and people can learn from that. If there aren't people digging that stuff up and bringing it forward, no one's going to learn those lessons.
I agree. I think in terms of it, that needing to have that kind of conversation and discussion of it, since among other things, not if even on the local level of 15 hours now aren't aware of what happened with Madison and why it didn't go further, it's quite likely that it gets done again. Since there's always an immediacy. With capitalism as a whole, and I think with reformist tendencies, that in the here and now we have to, to balance budget and cut services because the unbalanced budget simply, that would be madness. And similarly, the notion that we have to defeat Walker, we have to push the recall because everything else, in terms of talking about general strike, that's too radical. That will alienate people. We have to be just focused on what here and now, which then that approach always ensures it's going to be a reactive.
I guess it's a matter of avoiding those sorts of impressionistic points of view that kind of lead people down these false paths to solutions. It really, if you want to have any sort of success, however you define that, it is a matter of taking the long view and understanding how the present has come to be, rather than just taking the present as it is and extrapolating into the future.
Yeah, and I guess the other thing, though, as historians working things, is why not bring the level of the politics and organization and anti-capitalism to our own work as well. We're like other workers in this are highly exploited. Simply run the hours work, the pay received. In that sense, we're not a model or even strongly connected with any other aspect of the struggle unless we are performing it ourselves, unless we're actually going on strike, unless we're forming resistance and are using sort of collective action to both advance in terms of larger causes of it and sort of specific material interests. That's the thing I think.
We're not outsiders.
Right.
We're brought into the struggle whether or not we want to be or not.
And you've got to think. I think to just say historian. Well, there's at least three parts of our job, right? Reading and research, producing history, like writing things, and then teaching. So the level of what you're going to bring to whichever element. We know as people in the discipline that there are certain hoops that you have to jump through to get things published. There's certain hoops that you have to jump through to complete a dissertation, things like that are really beyond your control. And if you want to stick in a really tough job market, you have to do things like you actually have to sell your dignity on some levels, right? You have to jump through hoops. We got to be aware of that. But in the classroom, nobody is coming in there and telling me what to do, right, necessarily in the classroom. And as a reader and a researcher, I am really sort of choosing my own path. And so I think that, separating, and, a great way to think about this in like Marxist terms, right, separating the things that we produce, even, which is much different. Like, it's not so abstract to us. Like, we're producing things that are very dear to us. But we also have to sort of satisfy requirements that we don't make in order to do that. But I think, you divide those roles up and think about the role as a teacher, not necessarily, I don't think that you need to offer a blueprint, but I think that, and I think that students are and also, young people who are age 18 who are like transitioning to age 22. I think that you're going to find somebody, who's just like all of a sudden gets to college and becomes like this gung-ho Democrat because it's the first time they've ever really thought about politics. It's like, all right, well, fine, I've got you there. Now let's try to bring you further and further and further and bringing students along. It's sort of like, showing them the mountaintop and letting them pick whatever way they want to get there. But, at the top, I would like all my students to sort of say, like, wow, this is a really terrible situation that we live in. Like, if there's anything that's an objective truth, it's that the system is bad right now. It is terrible for human beings. It is killing the planet. It is killing people. It is making people work ridiculously long hours for zero reward. And, I've worked at several factories, guys who are 48 years old, they're on their third heart attack, giant beer bellies, their knees don't work, their ankles don't work. This is destroying people. It's totally fair to tell students that, right? Because that's the truth. That's the truth that we're living with. We can get into the postmodern elements of it, and that's fine too. And to think that our research isn't worthless, because there's this sort of idea is like we can write this book and 200 people will read it. Well, you know what your job is if you work for a company? You go and look at the exact same documents that a historian does and says, all right, how do people in this neighborhood with this income and these racial characteristics and this family structure and these dwelling units, how do they shop? And they do the same kind of research that we do to sort of say, like, what happened here? They're doing that same research to say, let's advertise these French fries in this neighborhood here that we've determined. And let's advertise, the college mail-in program at 3 a.m, because we've targeted these viewers. Like, research is used all the time for the benefit of capitalism. So we can use research against it, I think,
maybe,
on some level.
Although structurally, the research that's used is part of consumer things, but it does actually have impact of it and can get formed people to make policy.
Buy my book to find out how to get.
When's the contrast of time that in terms of chancellor or board of regents, governor, called up faculty who had studied about aspects of, in terms of investment and what was going to be even on its own terms, what would be sort of effective or not. And I don't know. The fact that no matter how sort of brilliant and how much research do of it, when it's going to be done for academic press that will ensure that a very small number of people does seem that it limits the impact. It becomes a ritual that have to perform and jump through, and in some cases has practical validity. I guess both of you have a advantage in that in terms of what your actual field of specialty and tying much more closely to where we're in now situation. I look at 19th century travel accounts in British, and so I think some of the links there become somewhat less useful. But either way, I become at a conceptual level more interested in teaching as just anything else. They take the 200 people that do the book, which 200 copies, not ensured how many people over a given decade might actually go through and read through it, as opposed to TAs have done 100 students in a semester. Either way, that is a partial, velvet, a partial way to soapbox for a given part. I don't think it's inherently necessarily that effective. If it actually was that dangerous and disruptive, it would be regulated by the state a lot more than it is. To some extent, sort of left to do own stuff because, no, we're not going to convert 100 people into hardcore activists by the sheer focus of our presentation. But we can maybe provide some larger context that otherwise could.
Yeah, certainly in teaching in the classroom, you have this opportunity to try and impart critical thinking skills to students, and maybe present certain radical ideas. But as an informed individual, as a teacher or a professor should be, that there's also opportunity to take your political activity outside of the classroom. There are opportunities to teach outside the university. There are opportunities to take part in political activity. Participate in political parties, political protests, things like this. So there are a lot more opportunities, I think, for academics outside of the field of academia.
Probably just by virtue of having the context that suggests some degree of greater where energy might be able to be effectively focused. I guess the other thing is, returning to John's earlier point, that I think that the effective approaches of it has to be disruptive, has to be anti-authoritarian, has to be in opposition to authority. Even though the irony is that even though I think capitalism does a much better job of melting down the planet than sort of the wide-eyed radicals ever aim to or ever
Yeah.
could, still it's going to, if they're remotely smart, are going to make sure that in terms of police services and the parliamentary procedures are the last things that are cut to oblivion, so that they're still preserving the facade of what's legitimate, what's reasonable, what's accepted, and that's something that people as individuals and groups have to be acting against. So in that sense, the tactics that work in building a sort of disaffected workforce into a disaffected and radicalized workforce are likely to be more valuable than almost anything else in Vision. I mean, in terms of how those conversations happen, and what's different based on in different disciplines, but also what's the same.
I wouldn't, I wouldn't discount teaching because, and sort of, I think that we're all kind of, barring extreme disaster or sort of some sort of immediate thing that is going to kill, a quarter of the world's population or something like that. You got to be thinking for the long haul, and you can think that your role changes too. And I think that Niles is getting at this. Maybe your role is to do research at one point, and then maybe you lose your house, and then your role is to join a group that is fighting to keep people from getting thrown out of their house, and maybe your role is to be nonviolent until a cop cracks your friend's skull open in front of you, and then maybe your role is to become violent, right? Like that you don't think of a role for yourself necessarily, but to be adaptable and to think meeting the system where it is. If I have a cop in my class or someone who's trying to become a police officer, and if they agree with me on most points by the end of the class, then I feel like, well, there's a cop who's probably going to think twice before they start shooting people who are just like them, like workers just like them. And we've seen that, there have been times where recently that police refuse to throw people out of their home. I mean, that to me is, that's the ultimate policy, right? Is here's a badge and a gun. This is like where capitalism can really meet you in the street, I guess, and show you how dangerous and volatile and vile it is. It's one thing to lose your money. It's another thing to lose your life trying to protect your home or your family or something like that. The roles can always be changing, and, as teachers, and even, your book might not do anything. You have 20,000 students. If you impart something to, 10,000 of them, we've got to think of this as like a long, I would say, give Marx more time, right? Like, and I don't know what necessarily, I don't think there's going to be a glorious revolution, but I think that, capitalism has dominated for 200 years. Why would we, and does it by building itself so ingrained into the system that people do think that you're insane for challenging it. That's, I don't think that you are going to convince a lot of people to be violent until you've done a lot of things, a lot of work. And I don't think that you are going to, it's not going to be like an overnight. So every little thing that you can do is important, and you're going to have multiple roles. And that is going to totally depend on circumstances, right?
Yeah, it's a process. And people are drawn into struggle whether or not they want to be. No one exists outside of the historical process, and events will unfold. And as teachers and as academics, I think we need to take our jobs seriously and think about what it is we're presenting to people, and what sort of perspective we're presenting, and how that is going to affect maybe 200 people, but that's still affecting 200 people.
Agreed. Yeah, I think I agree with a lot of sentiment there. Partly it's since I think, both as historians and radicals, the first thing has to be done is understanding the space that operate in, both the structures that make it problematic and also our ability to influence that and our ability not to. So when it's time for in terms of when it's time for a slogan, when it's time for a speech, when it's time to lie down on the ground and force police to drag people out, either way become, just I think learning that and perhaps learning more than activists have just becomes what will mark us as more effective in the long run. I guess the sort of broader perspective of that, the ability to work through and, the potential ecological, apocalypse that forms of it. I guess the other thing
likely.
Yeah, well, likely even is, I guess only proponent of optimism. I think that people become often better than capitalism trains us to expect. Among other things, any disaster movie has if there's a notion of suddenly order breaks down and suddenly there's no stability, mass attacks and looting and indiscriminate destruction, whereas actually is a great deal of evidence to show that this contrast, people as a whole react more empathetically, more cooperatively, are able to, even in uniquely stressful situations, in fact, even with the absence of authority of it, are better in many cases at forming and risking themselves and going against the game theory type logic, but instead acting in a way that makes better long-term success for most people. So,
two examples: Dresden, right, and then the fact that all protests are nonviolent until police show up, right?
Becomes. So I guess, if nothing else, that there's some successful mechanisms by which might be able to build something effective even out of the death of half the species, or perhaps some effective. I don't know. The other part is that as strong as these forces are, it's only a collective either sort of apathy or acceptance, or I think in some cases a flawed understanding of the role of the world, or just individual cynicism to the point of demobilization that allows it to continue. There's nothing, I think, written that prevents us from altering and agitating and transforming that.
Yeah.
I wouldn't throw emotion out of there too, right? There's a lot of you get patted on the back for doing certain things, and if from your life as a child until the time you're, say, 18 or something, when you're a senior in high school and you theoretically have more freedom to construct your own individuality, well, if people have constantly patted you on the back for being a hard worker, right? Like, don't complain about your job. Be a hard worker. It's like, if my job sucks, like, if people aren't going to say, like, no one should do this job, it's terrible, or no one should do it for this kind of money or for that many hours a week, instead of, like, the attitude that prevails for usually the people who are actually working the hardest is, right, like, hard work never killed anyone. It's like, actually it kills tons of people all the time, and it kills them slowly, and it's an ugly, long, tragic death, and it's not very happy. Like, hard work destroys people. If your idea of hard work is like, you should go and work 5 12s, a week at the factory and just stand on your feet pulling a lever all day, like, you're stupid to not do that. Like, that's a dangerous mentality, and I think that it's pervasive, and mainly for a lot of people to say, well, how am I supposed to put food on the table? It's like, that's why I say, get a chicken coop in a garden.
Any other closing thoughts?
Yeah, I think the last thing I like to say is that change beyond capitalism to a socialist system, or whatever alternative you envision is possible, but it's not inevitable. It's something that has to be worked for. It's something that has to be worked out. Something that has to be organized, and it is a struggle. You can't just sit back and fold your arms and wait for the revolution to come. It's hard work, and it's entirely possible.
Excellent. And if we don't, perhaps it's not just half the planet that gets killed off, but all of it, or all of humanity. So, in any case, fairly severe stakes.
I feel like, I don't know if we're gonna make it in our lifetime, but I feel like in the next 75 years, some sort of event will happen that will present, if you want to call it a revolutionary system, or a revolutionary situation, or maybe like a catastrophic situation to the extent that we maybe have never seen before, because I think things are getting worse, so they'd be exacerbated. If we have World War II now, it's going to be much worse, right? And people are already much more ready to act, I think. Occupy shows that. A lot of people who were not politically radical at least did something simple to do at that point, but you never know what circumstances will drive people to do. So I could say I think that it's inevitable that some moment is going to come, because the system is built with several potentials for that. So what happens is in part up to all of us.
And people say historians aren't optimistic. All right. Well, again, thanks to both guests for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
Say to all listeners to stay tuned if you want to catch the Killer Radio Show. It should be starting in several minutes. And then, as always, same time next week, Tuesday. Join in again for another episode of Size of Thoughts. Thank you.